In the shadows of gold-plated thrones, history hides its darkest secrets. These weren't fairy tale monarchs. They were murderers, madmen, tyrants, and traitors ruling with iron fists and blood-stained crowns. From emperors who buried scholars alive to kings who drowned concubines on suspicion alone, this isn't the royalty you learned about in school. This is the truth they locked behind palace doors. Welcome to 53 Dark Royal Facts. A brutal, brilliant descent into the twisted world of absolute power. Buckle up. The crown is heavy, and so is the body count. Before we dive headfirst into the madness, make sure you're subscribed, because around here, history doesn't wear a crown, it wields a sword. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila, lunch break in London. Let's see how far this royal bloodline stretches. Ivan the Terrible beat his pregnant daughter-in-law and accidentally killed his own son during a violent outburst. In the cold, candlelit halls of 16th century Russia, Tsar Ivan IV, better known to history as Ivan the Terrible, didn't just live up to his name. He exploded past it. There's a famous painting by Ilya Repin that shows Ivan cradling the limp body of his son, blood soaking into his robes. His eyes are wide, wild, horrified, like he's just realized what he's done. And that's because he had. In 1581, during one of his many volcanic fits of rage, Ivan struck his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing inappropriate clothing. When his son, his heir, confronted him about the abuse, Ivan did what Ivan did best. He snapped. With his iron staff, he smashed the young man's skull. The Tsarevich collapsed, dying slowly over the next few days. His unborn grandchild perished too. This wasn't an isolated incident. Ivan had a long, messy resume of rage. He once blinded the architect of St. Basil's Cathedral, so no one could ever build anything so beautiful again. He built a secret police force, the Oprichnina, who dressed in black, rode black horses, and conducted public executions for the slightest hint of disloyalty. His reign was soaked in blood, paranoia, and screaming ghosts. Yet for all his brutality, the thing that broke him might have been the thing he loved most. His own son. A father. A murderer. A man who collapsed into madness, clutching the body he'd destroyed with his own hands. And if you think that's as bad as a ruler can get, well, let's take a quick steamboat ride to Africa. King Leopold II of Belgium was responsible for the deaths of millions in the Congo Free State. Imagine calling yourself a humanitarian while turning a country into a hellscape. That's what King Leopold II of Belgium did in the late 1802 when he claimed the Congo Free State not for Belgium, but for himself, a private royal colony, a playground of suffering. He told the world he was on a civilizing mission. In reality, he was building one of the most horrific forced labor regimes in history. Under his rule, Congolese men were enslaved to harvest rubber. If they failed to meet quotas, Belgian agents would slice off their hands, or those of their children. Villages were burned, women were taken hostage, children mutilated. An estimated 10 million people died under his watch. 10 million. Photographs from the time show fathers kneeling next to severed hands and feet. They weren't props, they were punishment. Leopold turned mass amputation into company policy. And back in Europe, he was lauded, given medals, respected in high society. Even when the truth started leaking out, thanks to a few brave whistleblowers, Leopold dodged accountability with a shrug and a mustache twirl. It wasn't until 1908 that he was finally forced to cede the Congo to the Belgian state. But by then, the damage was irreversible. His legacy, a trauma that still haunts Central Africa today. And if you think burning villages and mutilating children was the lowest point in royal cruelty, wait until the Roman Empire throws a toga party from hell. Emperor Nero of Rome reportedly murdered his mother and burned Christians alive for entertainment. Rome was burning, and Emperor Nero was allegedly playing the lyre. That image of a mad emperor serenading flames is probably exaggerated, but what Nero did before and after the fire, that's where the real horror show begins. Born into politics and poison, Nero's reign was a Shakespearean bloodbath written in Latin. He reportedly had his stepbrother Britannicus killed, then arranged the murder of his own mother, Agrippina. First by trying to sink her on a sabotaged boat. When she swam back to shore like some Roman horror movie villain, he just sent assassins to finish the job. But Nero's most infamous act was how he handled the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. He blamed the Christians, then a small, unpopular sect, and ordered mass executions to distract the public. These weren't quick deaths. He had them torn apart by dogs, crucified, or most chillingly coated in pitch and set ablaze to light his garden parties. Human torches. In his backyard. The line between spectacle and statecraft blurred completely. Nero styled himself an artist, an actor, a poet. But his performances were backed by screams. Even the Roman Senate, no stranger to brutal politics, eventually had enough. Declared a public enemy, Nero fled the city and stabbed himself in the neck, assisted by a servant because he couldn't even do that alone. And just like that, the stage went dark. But don't relax just yet, because the next emperor tried justice and still turned executions into performance art. Emperor Jahangir of Mughal India kept chains in his palace, so subjects could ring them for justice, but he also ordered brutal executions for political rivals. To the common eye, Emperor Jahangir was a just ruler. Outside his palace in Agra, he had a massive golden chain installed 60 feet long, hung with bells, stretching from the rampart straight down to the people. Anyone could pull it. Anyone. No court officials, no bribery, no red tape. Just the clang of iron on gold, and the emperor's attention. It was revolutionary, symbolic, and a little ironic, because Jahangir also executed his enemies with the cold precision of a political surgeon. He inherited a glittering empire from his father, Akbar the Great, and seemed determined to balance justice with absolute control. While he painted himself as the ruler of mercy and fairness, dishing out pardons, listening to petitions, he was also busy turning executions into theatre. Nobles who plotted against him didn't just disappear. They were dragged through the streets, impaled, flayed. One rival prince was sewn into a raw ox hide and left to die in the desert sun, his body shrinking and blistering as the hide dried tighter. Jahangir wrote all this down in his own memoirs, with the clinical detachment of someone logging dinner recipes. He drank heavily, self-medicated with opium, and let his wife, the formidable Nur Jahan, wield more and more political power. Some say she was the real ruler. Others say Jahangir used that as cover, quietly purging dissent while presenting himself as a soft-hearted philosopher king. The golden chain may have rung for justice, but behind the palace walls, silence often meant death. And just when you thought things couldn't get more violently personal, here comes a royal with 6 wives, a god complex, and a chopping block. King Henry VIII executed 2 of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, and is suspected of causing the deaths of others through manipulation and neglect. Let's talk about the Tudor soap opera that bled across England, literally. King Henry VIII wasn't just infamous for having 6 wives, he was infamous for what happened to them. 2 were divorced, 2 were beheaded, 1 died in childbirth, and 1 survived by outliving him. That's not a love life. That's a massacre with a marriage license. The most infamous of his victims was Anne Boleyn, wife number 2. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but failed to produce the golden ticket, a male heir. Within a few short years, she was accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft. The evidence was laughable. Her trial, a joke. Her sentence, death by sword, not axe. Henry had it imported from France because even in execution, he had taste. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, fared no better. She was a teenager when Henry, then overweight and festering with leg ulcers, married her. She had past relationships scandalous for the time and maybe a few dalliances after marriage. Henry called it treason. Off with her head. But the darkness didn't end with beheadings. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was exiled and left to die in isolation. His fourth, Anne of Cleves, was publicly humiliated and discarded after just 6 months. And Jane Seymour, wife number 3, and mother to his only legitimate son, died days after childbirth, likely from postpartum infection that Henry, in his royal detachment, ignored. The church, meanwhile, bent to his will. When the Pope refused to annul his first marriage, Henry created his own church. 1 divorce later, the English Reformation was in full swing. Power, for Henry, meant cutting ties in the most literal way. And while heads were rolling in England, across the Channel, a queen was earning a nickname soaked in fire. Mary I of England burned over 280 Protestants at the stake, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Before the cocktail, before the ghost in the mirror party trick, there was the woman who made her name synonymous with flames. Mary I of England came to the throne in 1553 with a single mission: restore Catholicism. And she didn't waste time. In just 5 short years, she burned over 280 Protestants alive. Alive. She called it purification. Heretics called it hell on earth. The burnings began slowly, almost hesitantly, bishops, preachers, dissenters. But once the fires started, they didn't stop. Whole families were dragged out of homes. Men, women, the elderly, and even pregnant mothers were tied to stakes and set alight in marketplaces while crowds screamed and the smell of roasting flesh filled the air. She didn't just execute them, she made a spectacle of it. Even her own advisors were uneasy. Her husband, Philip II of Spain, tried to dial her back, but Mary doubled down. For her, this wasn't cruelty, it was duty. She saw herself as God's executioner, chosen to purge England of corruption. Her obsession with faith ran so deep, she believed that fire would cleanse the soul. Burn enough heretics, she thought, and England would return to the true path. Instead, it turned the nation against her. Her popularity collapsed, even Catholics winced. And when she died in 1558, no one mourned. The throne passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth, and the flames went out. But her name? That stuck. And if you thought that was the worst religious suppression in history, try mass academic genocide, courtesy of a Chinese emperor who buried ideas 6 feet under. Emperor Qin Shi Huang buried hundreds of scholars alive to suppress intellectual dissent. In ancient China, beneath the grandeur of unification and the glitter of the terracotta army, Emperor Qin Shi Huang buried not just bodies, but minds. He was the first emperor of a unified China, and with that title came a god-sized ego and a vision of eternal control. Roads, laws, currencies, all standardized. Great Wall construction kicked into high gear. His obsession with order was absolute, and that's where things turned sinister. The emperor wasn't fond of questions, especially the kind that came from Confucian scholars. These weren't rebels or soldiers. They were academics, philosophers, with ink-stained fingers and scrolls full of ideas. And those ideas? Dangerous. In 213 BCE, Qin ordered a mass book burning. Any text that wasn't about farming, medicine, or his dynasty's greatness was torched. History books? Gone. Poetry? Incinerated. Philosophy? Erased. But he didn't stop at scrolls. He went after the people who wrote them. Hundreds of scholars were rounded up, some say 460, others say over 700, and buried alive. Not metaphorically, literally, buried, alive, silenced forever, under layers of dirt and fear. Their only crime? Thinking differently. Qin called it purification, progress, control. What it really was? Intellectual genocide. His paranoia grew with his empire. He feared assassins, built decoy palaces, and sought the elixir of life from sorcerers and quacks. He drank mercury, believing it would make him immortal. It didn't. He died chasing eternity, leaving behind a nation where fear kept the peace and thought was a crime. And while his scholars were gasping for air underground, halfway across the world, another emperor was preparing to torture his own son above it. Peter the Great of Russia tortured and executed his own son, fearing he would stage a rebellion. Peter the Great built Russia with an axe in one hand and a blueprint in the other. He dragged the country out of medieval darkness and forced it, sometimes literally, into the modern world. But he didn't build an empire. He carved one. He westernized the Russian military, created a navy, built a brand new capital from scratch, St. Petersburg on a swamp, and demanded every noble shave their beard. And if you didn't comply, he'd do it himself, with a knife, at dinner. Yet the most brutal transformation was personal. His relationship with his son, Alexei, was a slow-motion train wreck fueled by fear, betrayal, and the iron logic of absolute power. Alexei wasn't a warrior like his father. He was quiet, thoughtful, more monk than monarch. That made Peter see him as weak, worse, dangerous. Rumors swirled of conspiracies, whispers of treason. Peter offered him a choice: serve the state or renounce the throne. Alexei fled the country. Peter dragged him back. What followed wasn't a trial. It was a public spectacle. The Tsar interrogated him personally, tortured him, and when that wasn't enough, had others torture him too. Eventually, Alexei confessed, whether truthfully or under duress is still debated. It didn't matter. Peter condemned him to death. He didn't even wait for the execution. Alexei died in his cell, bruised and broken, before the sentence could be carried out. Peter had built an empire, but at the cost of his bloodline. His only son died under his boot, and yet he felt no remorse, only relief. For Peter, Russia's future was worth more than family. But not every monarch tortured their heir. Some were too busy turning the entire royal court into a depraved bloodbath of lust and execution. The Korean king Yon Sanangun turned the palace into a debauched playground and executed thousands of scholars. King Yon Sanangun of Joseon, Korea, didn't just go mad, he made madness royal policy. His reign began with trauma. As a child, he learned that his mother, Queen Yun, had been executed by court officials, poisoned, erased. When he found out, he didn't mourn, he unraveled. He exhumed her body and gave her a royal funeral, then hunted down everyone who had anything to do with her death. The result? The first literati purge. Hundreds of Confucian scholars were executed, heads rolled, literally. The royal court, once filled with ink and diplomacy, became a morgue. But Yon Sanangun didn't stop. His paranoia blossomed into full tyranny. The second literati purge followed. Thousands more were killed or exiled. Libraries were destroyed. Thought became treason. With the intellectuals gone, the king turned inward and downward. He filled the palace with entertainers, dancers, and courtesans, built massive pleasure halls, and forced officials' wives into service. The court became an orgy wrapped in silk and soaked in blood. He even turned a state examination hall, once a sacred space for scholars, into a brothel. He banned criticism, closed schools, burned books. Royal proclamations were no longer written in classical Chinese, the language of governance, but in Korean, so even peasants could read his madness. Eventually, the people and court had enough. He was overthrown in a coup and exiled, dying far from the luxury he drowned in. From scholars to concubines, from reason to ruin, Yon Sanangun took an entire dynasty down with his rage. And as Korea tried to rebuild, another empire was cracking under the weight of one ruler's deadly indifference to his own starving people. Tsar Nicholas II's indifference to his starving people helped fuel the Russian Revolution, ending with his own family being executed. The last Tsar of Russia didn't fall from the throne so much as sleepwalk off the edge of it, dragging his entire bloodline with him. Nicholas II wasn't a monster by nature. He was worse. He was passive. While the Romanov dynasty boiled in its own arrogance, Nicholas smiled politely and changed nothing. His people starved. His soldiers died in trenches. His children played in gilded halls. He ruled like a man, waiting for history to stop bothering him. He came to power in 1894, young, unprepared, and deeply in love with his wife, Alexandra. But love didn't feed the peasants. It didn't stop the war with Japan. It didn't fix the economy. His answer to protests? Violence. In 1905, on Bloody Sunday, peaceful demonstrators marched to the Winter Palace with petitions. His guards opened fire. Hundreds dead. Maybe more. Still, he carried on. World War I hit Russia like a hammer. Nicholas took personal command of the military, a catastrophic decision. His army collapsed, morale imploded, and back home, Alexandra was left in charge, heavily influenced by a mystic monk named Rasputin. Yes, that Rasputin. The Russian people weren't just furious. They were starving, freezing, dying. And yet the Romanovs hosted parties, ate delicacies, and ignored it all. Indifference became their legacy. By 1917, revolution swept through the streets. Nicholas abdicated. The royal family was placed under house arrest, then moved from palace to prison to increasingly remote exile. And then came the 17th of July, 1918. The family was led into a basement in Yekaterinburg under the pretense of a photo. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and a few loyal servants. What followed wasn't an execution. It was a slaughter. A chaotic, botched massacre with bullets ricocheting off jewels sewn into corsets, bayonets used to finish the job. The Romanovs died not with honor, but with confusion and screams. All because a Tsar couldn't be bothered to notice his empire burning. But even he never reached the levels of internal terror one queen unleashed on her own people, armed with poison, torture, and a smile. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar executed tens of thousands of her own people through brutal purges and torture. If isolation was a strategy, Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar turned it into a blood sport. She ruled from 1828 to 1861, and under her reign, Madagascar became a fortress of paranoia. Foreigners were expelled, trade was strangled, and Christianity was outlawed. Not discouraged, outlawed. Missionaries were killed, churches razed, converts hunted like prey. But the real horror was internal. Ranavalona didn't just distrust foreigners. She distrusted everyone, her own nobles, her army, her people. So she cleansed them over and over. Massive purges swept through the kingdom like wildfires, burning through families, villages, entire clans. Estimates suggest tens of thousands died. Some say hundreds of thousands. Execution was rarely swift. Torture was the warm-up act. Victims were forced to drink poison as part of an ordeal by tangena, a test of guilt or innocence. Spoiler, most didn't survive. If you vomited and lived, you were innocent. If not, well. Others were thrown off cliffs, beheaded, starved. The Queen revelled in public spectacles. Executions weren't just punishment, they were warnings etched into the soul of the nation. And yet, she survived assassination plots, dodged invasions, outmaneuvered colonial powers. Her brutality kept her in power for 33 years, 3 decades of rule, soaked in isolationism and blood. When she finally died, Madagascar opened up again. Foreigners returned, Christianity spread, the walls came down, but the scars remained. And while Ranavalona ruled in fear, her European counterpart across the sea ruled in silk, letting her people starve while dancing through mirrors and manicured gardens. Louis XIV of France outlawed Protestantism and forced conversions, while living extravagantly as the country starved. They called him the Sun King, not because he brought light, but because everything revolved around him. Louis XIV ruled France for over 70 years. That's longer than most countries exist. His court at Versailles was a fever dream of powdered wigs, mirrored halls, and gold-dripping fountains. He woke up to orchestras, dined with dozens of nobles watching. Even his bathroom breaks were events. But outside Versailles, France was suffering. Religious tensions simmered under his opulence. Protestants known as Huguenots had been tolerated under earlier kings, not under Louis. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted Protestants the right to worship. Suddenly, it was convert or flee, or worse. Churches were burned, schools were shut down, soldiers were quartered in Protestant homes to encourage conversion. Some families were tortured in front of their children. Entire communities vanished, fled to England, Prussia, the Netherlands. The brain drain was immense. But Louis didn't care. To him, a unified Catholic France was more important than human lives. Meanwhile, his wars drained the treasury. His palaces expanded while crops failed. Famines ravaged the countryside. People ate grass and bark. And Louis? He entertained 10,000 courtiers in rooms bigger than most towns. The irony? He believed it was all divine right, that his power came from God himself. So when peasants died, it was God's will. When Protestants screamed, it was God's justice. And when he died in 1715, after nearly 3/4 of a century on the throne, he left France in debt, starving, and on the slow march toward revolution. All that grandeur built on bones. And if you think that's dark, the next king made sure massacres didn't happen just in war. They happened in his own backyard. King James II of England ordered massacres of Irish civilians, such as the Siege of Derry and the Battle of the Boyne. James II of England wasn't just a king in exile, he was a man desperate to claw his way back onto the throne, and he didn't care how much blood it took to pave the path. Deposed in the glorious revolution of 1688 by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, James fled to Catholic-friendly France. But instead of accepting his fate, he rallied support in Ireland, where many Catholic subjects still saw him as the rightful king, and James saw them as tools. The Irish campaign of 1689-1691 was supposed to be his triumphant return. Instead, it became a bloodbath. It started with the Siege of Derry. Protestant civilians, men, women, and children crowded inside the walled city, refusing to surrender. James's forces surrounded them for 105 brutal days. Supplies ran out. People ate rats, dogs, leather. Hundreds starved to death. When the siege finally broke, it was a hollow victory. The dead were piled high and the survivors were broken. Then came the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. More blood, more bodies. James's army, though numerically large, was disorganized. The Protestant forces of William crushed them. James didn't stay to fight. He fled again, earning the nickname Seamus and Chaka in Ireland, James the T. But the true horror lay in the wake of his campaign. Irish civilians, already caught between armies, suffered massacres, property seizures, and retaliatory killings. James's war wasn't about justice. It was about revenge, and when it failed, he abandoned his supporters and lived out his life in France praying, sulking, irrelevant. His legacy? Sectarian violence, deepened religious divides, and generations of hatred. And while James unleashed holy war on civilians, another emperor across the globe was rewriting justice with both chains and blood. Emperor Hirohito oversaw Japan's expansion during World War II, including war crimes committed in China and Korea. Emperor Hirohito wore white gloves, spoke softly, and studied marine biology, but his reign oversaw some of the most brutal atrocities of the 20th century. From 1926 to 1989, Hirohito sat on Japan's chrysanthemum throne. But it was the war years that stained his legacy in blood. Under his watch, Japan launched a campaign of imperial expansion that turned the Pacific into a battlefield and left civilian populations reeling. In China, the 1937 Nanjing massacre saw Japanese troops slaughter an estimated 200,000 civilians in just 6 weeks. Women were raped, babies were bayoneted, streets ran red. The soldiers weren't rogue elements, they were operating under the flag of the empire with the tacit approval of the throne. In Korea, occupation meant forced labor, cultural erasure, and the horror of comfort women. Girls and young women coerced into sexual slavery to serve Japanese troops. Entire generations were scarred. Throughout the war, Hirohito remained the face of the nation, a living god. His image adorned propaganda posters. His voice commanded obedience. Yet when the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan finally surrendered in 1945, the world faced a dilemma: prosecute the emperor or preserve the illusion of stability. The US chose the latter. Hirohito was spared trial. He renounced his divinity in a scripted radio address and became a constitutional figurehead. But the bodies, millions of them, were buried beneath his era. His personal responsibility remains debated, but the silence was deafening. He lived until 1989, quietly collecting marine specimens while history tried to decide what kind of man he really was. But the next king didn't leave room for mystery. His crimes were personal, deliberate, and locked behind dungeon doors. King John of England starved his political enemies to death in prison, including a mother and her young son. King John didn't just rule England, he ruled its prisons. And what happened inside those stone walls was often worse than the battlefield. You might know him as the villain from Robin Hood tales, the greedy monarch squeezing peasants for gold. But the real John was more sinister than any storybook could handle. He lost lands in France, extorted his barons, and triggered a civil war so chaotic that it birthed the Magna Carta, a document created not from high ideals, but raw desperation to curb his tyranny. But John's darkest acts didn't happen in war. They happened in silence, in the dark, behind locked doors. Take Maud de Browse. Her husband fell out of favour with the king, and when she refused to hand over hostages, including her own son John, ordered both imprisoned, not just jailed, starved to death. No food, no water, just stone, chains, and time. They died slowly in Windsor Castle, their bodies eventually discovered curled together in a final embrace of horror. John didn't stop there. He used starvation as a political tool, removing food from prisoners not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. He delighted in control, in making his enemies beg, fade, and die forgotten. Even the church turned against him. He was excommunicated. His barons rebelled. Foreign powers invaded. John fought to keep control, but his paranoia and cruelty had rotted his foundation. He died in 1216, likely from dysentery fitting, perhaps for a man whose reign was a slow decay of justice and decency. And if starving prisoners sounds horrific, the next queen proved that betrayal could come dressed in pearls and end with an executioner's axe. Queen Elizabeth I executed her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, despite promising her safety. The Virgin Queen ruled with brains, flair, and a dagger behind her back. Elizabeth I of England was the face of a golden age Shakespeare, sea power, and that iconic pale face framed in lace. But behind the poetry and portraits, she could be cold, ruthless, calculating. Nothing proved that more than the fate of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary fled to England in 1568, seeking protection after a rebellion ousted her from the Scottish throne. Elizabeth promised safety, a royal welcome, sanctuary. What Mary got was 19 years of house arrest and a slow-motion death sentence. Mary was a Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, a legitimate heir to the English throne, and a lightning rod for rebellion. Plots to replace Elizabeth with Mary erupted like boils throughout the 1572nd and 82nd. Most failed. Some weren't even real, just whispers and forged letters. But one stuck. The Babington plot of 1586 claimed Mary was involved in a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and seize the throne. Whether she actually consented is still debated, but the evidence, real or manufactured, was enough. Elizabeth signed the death warrant, then hesitated, then signed it again. She tried to play innocent afterward, blaming her advisors, but the execution went forward. On the 8th of February, 1587, Mary was led to the scaffold in a red dress, the color of martyrdom. It took 2 swings of the axe, maybe 3. The first blow struck her head but didn't sever it. The second nearly finished. The third removed the remaining flesh. Her lips kept moving, witnesses said, for minutes after. Elizabeth wept publicly, claimed it was a mistake, but she never reversed it. The Queen had neutralized her greatest threat, and while England bathed in candlelight politics, the Ottoman Empire was busy drowning concubines on suspicion alone. Sultan Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire drowned 280 concubines after suspecting infidelity. Madness in a palace isn't new, but Sultan Ibrahim I took it to operatic heights. Known as Ibrahim the Mad, he emerged from a dark past, locked in a windowless room for most of his youth, living under constant threat of execution. When his brother died and he ascended the throne in 1640, he emerged blinking, twitching, and completely unhinged. At first, he reveled in luxury. Carpets made of sable fur, diets of gold-dusted figs, obsessions with scents, textures, and women, especially women. Ibrahim filled the harem with hundreds of concubines, allegedly choosing many based on bizarre criteria like body shape or scent. But his paranoia didn't stay quiet for long. Whispers reached him that one of his beloved had been unfaithful. Instead of investigating, he made a decision worthy of horror fiction. He ordered all 280 women in his harem to be tied in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait, every single one, drowned. It wasn't a purge, it was a tantrum, an act of royal psychosis wrapped in velvet robes. Afterward, he continued his reign of instability, raising taxes to fund his excesses, executing advisors on whims, and once reportedly trying to feed coins to fish because he thought they'd multiply them. Eventually, even the palace couldn't tolerate him. In 1648, he was deposed by his own court and executed shortly after. Ibrahim left behind a trail of silk-draped corpses and the reminder that absolute power in unstable hands leads straight to the bottom of the sea. But even royal madness can be cunning. The next king didn't throw away lives in madness, he raised children to hold on to power. King Richard III allegedly ordered the murder of his nephews, the princes in the Tower, to secure the throne. 2 boys entered the Tower of London. They never came out. In 1483, after the death of Edward IV, his 2-year-old son Edward V was supposed to take the throne, but his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had other ideas. He declared the marriage of Edward IV invalid, making the young king illegitimate. Parliament agreed, or was forced to. Richard crowned himself Richard III. He placed Edward and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, in the Tower of London for their protection. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens, waving from windows. Then the sightings stopped. Theories swarmed. The most enduring? Richard had them murdered in secret, smothered in their sleep, stabbed or buried beneath stone. No trial, no announcement, just silence. 2 royal children erased. With them gone, Richard's claim to the throne looked airtight, but whispers never stopped. The guilt clung to him like mold. Even Shakespeare turned him into a villainous hunchback, a cursed usurper who killed for a crown. Whether Richard truly ordered the murders is still debated. But the fact remains, The princes vanished under his watch, and he profited from it. His reign was short. In 1485, he died at the Battle of Bosworth, crying out for a horse as Henry Tudor's forces cut him down. His body was lost for centuries. Found in a parking lot. Buried again with a headstone and asterisks. A king who may have killed children to sit on a throne and ended up under concrete. And if murder for power shocks you, wait until you meet the dynasty that invented a chair just to break human spines. Ming dynasty emperors used elaborate torture chambers, known as tiger benches, for interrogation. Beneath the ornate rooftops and imperial silk of Ming China lay dungeons filled with screams. The Ming dynasty, lasting from 1368 to 1644, was a cultural high point for China. Art flourished, the Great Wall expanded, porcelain reached perfection. But behind the scrolls and silk screens was a brutal machinery of control, and few tools were as feared as the tiger bench. It wasn't a myth, it was real. A torture device, elegant in its simplicity and horrific in its effect. The victim, usually a political prisoner, rival court official, or accused dissident, would be bound to a bench, legs extended straight out, ankles tied tight. Then bricks or wooden planks were slid under the feet, raising them higher and higher. The knees bent in ways they weren't meant to. Ligaments tore, bones cracked, blood vessels burst. Screams echoed off the palace stones. It was slow, methodical, designed not just to break the body, but the soul. And it worked. Confessions came easily under the tiger bench, whether true or not. That didn't matter. In an empire obsessed with order and hierarchy, guilt was often predetermined. Torture was just the ceremony. The worst part? It wasn't just used in the deepest pits of the imperial prisons. It was part of the bureaucratic routine. Corruption trials, treason accusations, religious interrogations, any excuse to strap someone in. Some emperors used it liberally, others pretended not to know, but the device itself endured, a symbol of a dynasty that blended artistic glory with institutional cruelty. And while bones were being splintered in China, a king in Europe was splintering reality, building castles for fantasies while his kingdom collapsed. King Ludwig II of Bavaria bankrupted his kingdom on insane castle-building sprees while withdrawing into delusion. King Ludwig II didn't want to rule, he wanted to dream. In 1864, he inherited the throne of Bavaria, but Ludwig wasn't interested in war, politics, or governance. He wanted beauty, romance, operas. He idolized Wagner, dressed like a medieval knight, and spoke like a man born in the wrong century. So he built castles. Not one, not two, a sprawling fantasy of them, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, all extravagant, all surreal. Towers, fountains, mirrored halls, fake grottos, moonlit murals, each more expensive than the last. Neuschwanstein alone looked like something straight out of a fairy tale and cost the kingdom a fortune. The problem? Bavaria couldn't afford dreams. Ludwig didn't care. He borrowed, taxed, and drained his treasury to fund his visions. He lived alone in his castles, rarely attending court, preferring candle-lit dinners with imaginary guests and walks under stars that no one else was allowed to see. As debts mounted, his ministers grew alarmed. They sent doctors to evaluate him, declared him insane without even examining him in person. On the 12th of June, 1886, they deposed him. The next day, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg, alongside the very doctor who had pronounced him mad. Officially, drowned. Unofficially, nobody knows. The Mad King, buried beneath water and myth. His castles still stand today, testaments to one man's descent into fantasy. Beautiful, haunting, empty. But Ludwig's delusions didn't kill millions. The next royal kept his charm polished, his smile camera ready, and cozy meetings with history's darkest villains. King Edward VIII of Britain was a Nazi sympathizer and met with Hitler even after abdicating. He gave up the crown for love, but what he kept was far more dangerous. Edward VIII reigned as King of the United Kingdom for less than a year. In 1936, he abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American socialite. The British government said it was scandalous, unconstitutional, romantic, maybe, but the story doesn't end there. After his abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor and started getting friendly with fascism. He and Wallis toured Nazi Germany in 1937, just 2 years before the war. They met with Hitler, smiled for photos, gave salutes. He praised the regime's efficiency and openly criticized Britain's policies. The Duke reportedly said that bombing England would bring peace faster. It wasn't just naivety. Secret communications between German diplomats hinted at a plan. If Britain fell, Hitler would restore Edward to the throne as a puppet monarch. They even gave the operation a name, code name, Willie. Wartime intelligence confirmed his sympathies. MI5 and other agencies surveilled him. Churchill, alarmed, sent Edward to a far-off post as governor of the Bahamas, a gilded exile, far from Europe's fire. There, he lived comfortably, hosting parties while the world burned. He and Wallis denied everything after the war, but the evidence kept surfacing, documents, photos, letters. Edward died in 1972, still insisting he'd done nothing wrong. But history remembers the Duke of Windsor not as a tragic lover, but as a royal who flirted with fascism and nearly dragged a monarchy into the shadow of the swastika. And if that's not chilling enough, the next empress clawed her way to the top, starting with the murder of her own child. Empress Wu Zetian of China murdered her own infant daughter to frame the empress and seize power. In the corridors of China's Tang dynasty, where jade glinted and incense coiled through imperial halls, a concubine named Wu Zetian played a game no woman had dared to master. She aimed to take the throne, and she didn't mind getting blood on her hands to get there. Originally a concubine to Emperor Taizong, Wu was sent to a convent after his death, as was customary, but she didn't stay long. Somehow, she returned to court and became consort to the next emperor, Gaozong. A rare move, a dangerous one. The other consorts, threatened. The reigning empress, in the way. That's when the unthinkable happened. Wu gave birth to a daughter. Within days, the child was dead, smothered. And according to most accounts, Wu herself killed the baby, then accused Empress Wang of the crime. The court was horrified. Grief turned to rage. Gaozong, convinced of his wife's guilt, stripped Wang of her title. Wu took her place, and she didn't stop. She eliminated every rival, real or imagined. Executions, forced suicides, torture. Her rise was paved with betrayal. She manipulated the emperor, wielded influence in his name, and when he died, she didn't pass the power to their sons. She took it for herself. By 690, Wu Zetian declared herself emperor, not empress, not regent emperor of China. the only woman in over 2 millennia to ever hold that title. She ruled with brutal efficiency, promoted merit, championed Buddhism, but her justice was often soaked in fear. Dissenters vanished. Critics were exiled, executed, or mutilated. She even had statues erected of herself beside the great emperors. A mother, a murderer, a monarch. And while Wu's blade carved through court politics, across the Channel, another queen orchestrated a massacre so massive it changed the course of France. Catherine de' Medici orchestrated the Street Bartholomew's Day massacre, killing thousands of Protestants. She came from Florence, married into France, and ruled from the shadows. Catherine de' Medici was never meant to hold power, but when her husband died and her sons were too weak or too young to rule, she stepped in. And when Protestant Catholic tensions boiled over in France, she poured gasoline on the fire. In 1572, she arranged the marriage of her Catholic daughter, Margaret, to the Protestant nobleman Henry of Navarre. It was supposed to be a gesture of peace, a royal wedding to unite the kingdom. But Catherine had other plans. Days after the wedding, thousands of Protestants, Huguenots, were gathered in Paris to celebrate. Catherine and her advisors saw an opportunity. On August 24, Street Bartholomew's Day, the assassinations began. The target was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a leading Protestant figure. He was shot, then finished with blades. Then the slaughter spread. Catholics turned on their Protestant neighbours. Homes were raided. Women, children, nobles, peasants, all butchered. Bodies dumped into the Seine. Blood ran through cobblestone streets. For a week, Paris became a horror show. The violence spread to other cities: Orléans, Lyon, Toulouse. Estimates vary, but as many as 10,000 to 30,000 Protestants were killed. Catherine stayed quiet. Some said she orchestrated the entire thing. Others claim she merely allowed it. Either way, she benefited. Protestant power was shattered, and her grip on the monarchy tightened. Her legacy? A queen who smiled through a bloodbath and then held mass. But sometimes, the throne doesn't just poison the soul, it twists the flesh. The next king wasn't evil by design. He was born into a body so broken by inbreeding, it nearly destroyed his kingdom. King Charles II of Spain was so inbred that he could barely speak or eat, yet was forced to reign for decades. His Habsburg jaw jutted like a broken hinge. His tongue was too big for his mouth, his mind uncertain. Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the last in a long line of dynastic inbreeding that looped back on itself like a cursed family tree. His parents were uncle and niece. His ancestors had married their own cousins for generations. The result? A boy who never stood a chance. He didn't walk until age 8, couldn't speak clearly, struggled to chew. He suffered seizures, hallucinations, and bouts of paranoia. He believed he was cursed, possessed. And honestly, it wasn't far from the truth. But he was king. So the court pretended. Ministers ruled in his name. Priests exorcised his demons. Courtiers gossiped behind velvet drapes. While Europe expanded and changed, Spain stagnated. The economy faltered. Colonies rebelled. Charles couldn't govern, couldn't produce an heir, couldn't even control his own body. Doctors examined his corpse after death. They said his heart was the size of a peppercorn. His body had no blood. His testicles were black. His stomach rotted. He died at 38. Spain wept for the end of a dynasty, not the man. His death triggered the War of Spanish Succession. His life? A warning written in bloodlines and bone. And while Charles was a tragedy of biology, the next king chose his fate. He didn't inherit madness, he packed it in a suitcase and fled with it. Alongside stolen treasures and a collapsing crown, King Farooq of Egypt stole priceless treasures from his own museums and fled with them when overthrown. Imagine a king so obsessed with collecting things, coins, clocks, women, food that he ended up hoarding the very soul of his country. King Farooq of Egypt reigned from 1936 to 1952, and at first, people loved him. Young, handsome, and Western educated, he arrived on the throne with promises of reform. But power did what power always does. It bloated him, literally and figuratively. Farooq developed an insatiable appetite. He gorged on caviar and foie gras, ballooned in size. Some reports claim he ate 20 meals a day, but food wasn't his only vice. He became a compulsive thief, stealing from foreign dignitaries, private citizens, even his own government. One day, a guest would notice a diamond pin missing. The next, a rare coin would vanish. Where did they go? Right into Farooq's royal vaults. But his true heist was national. Farooq pillaged Egypt's own museums, looting antiquities and artifacts for his private collection. Gold statues, royal relics, ancient manuscripts, all hoarded like dragon treasure. Meanwhile, the people suffered. Corruption soared. British influence lingered like a shadow. His rule became a joke, his habits obscene. He once ordered a sandwich in the middle of a high-level diplomatic meeting. Another time, he bought a yacht just because it was slightly bigger than Hitler's too. Farooq was living in luxury while Egypt teetered on the brink. In 1952, the military had enough. Led by the Free Officers Movement, a coup swept through Cairo. Farooq abdicated, boarded a ship with his family and crates of stolen treasure and sailed into exile. He died in Italy, overweight and irrelevant, choking on a meal he couldn't finish. Egypt, for all its pain, was finally free of its kleptomaniac king. But while Farooq stole for pleasure, the next ruler executed his own family, not for greed, but for control. Korean King Gwanghaegun executed his own stepmother and brother to consolidate power. In the royal palaces of Joseon, Korea, blood was thicker than water, but not thick enough to stop a blade. Gwanghaegun, born the illegitimate son of King Seonjo, clawed his way to the throne after years of political turbulence. He wasn't the crown prince, but he was competent, clever, and, crucially, alive when the kingdom needed a leader. So he ruled, and then he removed. His biggest threats? His stepmother, Queen Enmok, and his younger half-brother, Grand Prince Yongchang, the legitimate heir. The boy was just a child. But that didn't matter. Gwanghaegun accused them of treason, had Yongchang imprisoned, then executed. Some say he was strangled with a silken cord. Others whisper that poison was used. Either way, the child died before he had the chance to speak for himself. Queen Enmok fared slightly better. Exiled, imprisoned, kept under strict surveillance. Her court disbanded, her title revoked. She lived in isolation, watching the dynasty fracture. But Gwanghaegun wasn't just a butcher, he was also a reformer. He improved diplomacy with neighboring states, rebuilt after invasions, strengthened the military. Some historians argue he was one of Korea's most practical kings. But his blood-soaked path to the throne stained everything he touched. In 1623, His enemies struck back. Another coup. Gwanghaegun was deposed, exiled to a remote island, and erased from official records. No royal tomb. No grand funeral. Just the cold winds of history. His reign left a legacy of reforms and ghosts. And while Gwanghaegun wielded execution as strategy, the next queen wielded religion like a weapon, igniting a centuries-long purge that reshaped a continent. Queen Isabella of Spain launched the Inquisition, leading to mass torture, executions, and exile of Jews. She's remembered for funding Columbus. But Queen Isabella of Castile's most enduring legacy isn't discovery, it's persecution. In 1478, she and her husband, King Ferdinand, created something monstrous, the Spanish Inquisition. Its goal? Religious unity. Its method? Terror. At first, it targeted conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith. Then it expanded. Muslims, Protestants, anyone accused of heresy. No evidence required, just suspicion. Victims were dragged into dark chambers, tortured until they confessed. Stretching racks, water torture, crushing devices, all used in the name of God. Trials were secret. Defendants couldn't see the evidence against them. Confessions were extracted under duress. And the punishment? Often death. Public executions, autos da fe, became spectacles. Crowds gathered as victims were marched through the streets, robes marked with symbols of shame. Then the fires were lit. Thousands died. Thousands more fled. In 1492, the same year, Columbus sailed west. Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews from Spain. Entire communities uprooted overnight. Centuries of culture, scholarship, and trade gone. She claimed it was divine duty, but it was also about power. The Inquisition consolidated royal authority, crushed dissent, and centralized control under the crown. And it lasted. The Inquisition didn't end with Isabella. It stretched on for centuries, its fires burning long after she was buried in royal marble. Isabella's legacy isn't just ships and explorers. It's ash and silence. And as Spain purged faith with fire, Rome prepared for a different kind of depravity, one involving incest, horses, and a crown soaked in madness. Emperor Caligula named his horse, a senator and allegedly engaged in incest with his sisters. If power corrupts, then Caligula proves it can also twist, rot, and implode. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots, after the tiny soldier outfit he wore as a child on military campaigns. Romans adored the boy, but that affection didn't survive the man he became. He started his reign in 37 AD, with promise pardoning political enemies, handing out bonuses to soldiers, and staging elaborate games. But then something shifted. Maybe it was a fever. Maybe a mental break. Whatever it was, Caligula descended into absolute madness. He declared himself a living god, built temples to himself, ordered citizens to worship his statue or die. He showed up to banquets dressed as Venus or Apollo, surrounded by guards, gold, and silence. And in one of his most infamous acts, he made his favorite horse, Incitatus, a senator, gave it a marble stall, a jeweled collar, even a house with servants. Was it satire, a joke, or a warning that the Senate meant nothing? No one knew and no one dared to ask. But it wasn't just absurdity, it was depravity. Whispers in the palace said he slept with all three of his sisters. that he used them as concubines at public events, that he laughed about it at dinner. He also had people executed for the tiniest offences, a bad haircut, an awkward glance, or simply being related to someone who fell out of favour. He turned the imperial palace into a slaughterhouse where laughter and terror mixed freely. Eventually, even his own guards had enough. In 41 AD, the Praetorian Guard stabbed him to death in a corridor. The people didn't mourn. Rome exhaled. Caligula's legacy isn't just madness. It's a cautionary tale about unchecked power wrapped in blood-soaked luxury. And while Rome stumbled through one madman, England found itself gripped by a king so fragile, his mental collapse would ignite a civil war. King Henry VI of England's mental breakdowns led to violent civil wars, known as the Wars of the Roses. If ever a man was born to be king and yet destined not to rule, it was Henry VI. He inherited the English crown as a baby 9 months old after his father, the mighty warrior Henry V, died. But where his father had steel, Henry VI had fog. He was gentle, religious, soft-spoken. He read scripture while his nobles sharpened their knives. At first, England was managed by regents. But as Henry grew older, it became clear something wasn't right. He suffered catatonic episodes, days, weeks, even months, where he wouldn't speak, move, or recognize anyone. During one infamous breakdown, he reportedly didn't react to the birth of his own son. Court physicians whispered of divine punishment or demonic possession. In truth, it was likely a mental illness passed down through his bloodline. While Henry slipped in and out of lucidity, his nobles filled the vacuum. England split between two factions, the House of Lancaster, Henry's side, and the House of York. Ambition turned to murder. Disputes turned to war. What followed was the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest civil wars in English history. Battle after battle, brother against brother, royal against royal. England became a graveyard of banners and betrayed oaths. Henry was captured, deposed, reinstated, then deposed again. Each time weaker, each time more lost. Finally, in 1471, after the Battle of Tewkesbury, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. A month later, he was found dead, likely murdered on the orders of the Yorkist King Edward IV. Henry VI reigned over a kingdom on fire with a Bible in his hand and chaos at his feet. And while England bled itself dry in civil war, Korea offered a royal tragedy so intimate and slow, it felt like something out of a Gothic novel, only the monster was a rice chest. Prince Sado of Korea was locked in a rice chest by his father and left to starve over 8 days. There are royal punishments. And then there is what King Yongjo did to his son. Prince Sado was the heir to the Joseon throne, intelligent, artistic, but also deeply troubled. He suffered from violent mood swings, heard voices. He was said to roam the palace at night with a sword, attacking servants, threatening his own family. The court was terrified. His father, King Yongjo, was caught in a nightmare. A son too dangerous to rule, but too royal to execute. Korean law forbade a king from spilling the blood of a royal, so Yongjo found a loophole. On a sweltering July day in 1762, he ordered a large wooden rice chest, usually used for storing grain brought to the courtyard. Sado was ordered inside. The lid was sealed, and there he stayed, day after day. No food, no water, just heat, insects. And the knowledge that his father had condemned him to this, it took 8 days for him to die. The court recorded the screams, the smell, the servants' unease, but no one intervened. Sado's wife, Lady Hye-gyong, later wrote memoirs that described his decline not to justify, but to understand. Was he insane? Was he failed by the system? Or was he a monster shaped by palace pressure? After his death, the court declared he had died of illness to save face. But the truth festered like the memory of that chest. And as Korea mourned in silence, another queen across the world was dining on luxury while her starving people sharpened guillotines. Marie Antoinette lived in excess, while the people of France starved, earning her the infamous phrase, "Let them eat cake." She was born in Vienna, draped in velvet by the time she could walk, and married into France before she could spell it. Marie Antoinette, the teenage queen with powdered hair and a dazzling smile, became the living emblem of everything France hated about the monarchy. And the worst part? She didn't even see it coming. At Versailles, her world was gold. Gold trim, gold furniture, gold leaf on her desserts. She built a fake village, Les Hameaux de la Reine, to play dress-up as a peasant, complete with porcelain cows and silk aprons. Meanwhile, real peasants ate roots, if they were lucky. France was collapsing under the weight of its own debt. Bread prices soared, crops failed, children starved, and Marie's response? Reportedly, "Let them eat cake." Now, historians debate whether she ever actually said it, but the phrase stuck, not because it was accurate, but because it was believable. She gambled at court games, bought diamonds, held masked balls while Paris boiled in rage. Her husband, Louis XVI, was passive and indecisive. Marie took the spotlight and the blame. As revolution ignited in 1789, mobs stormed Versailles. The royal family fled, were captured, brought back to Paris, and imprisoned. Marie tried to stay regal, composed, but the city wanted blood. In 1793, she was tried for treason. The charges? Everything from conspiring with foreign powers to incest, wild, cruel accusations meant to inflame the public. The verdict? Guilty. On the 16th of October, 1793, she was paraded in an open cart to the guillotine. No carriage, no ceremony. Her hair was cut, her hands tied. She apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. Then the blade fell. The crowd roared. The queen of fashion, of excess, of blind privilege, gone in a flash of steel. And as her blood soaked the cobblestones, in Denmark, another king was unraveling not in revolt, but in the suffocating grip of madness. King Christian VII of Denmark was mentally ill and manipulated by his court, which led to executions and coups. Christian VII of Denmark was a monarch in name, but a ghost in life. He ascended the throne in 1766 at just 17, charming and well-read, but beneath the crown was a storm. Christian suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, or a similar condition. He would fall into manic episodes, hallucinate, speak nonsense in council meetings, or refuse to bathe or eat. The court didn't know what to do with him, so they did what courts do best: took control. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who became Christian's personal doctor and then his puppet master. Struensee rose quickly, becoming de facto ruler of Denmark. He pushed Enlightenment reforms, abolished torture, improved healthcare, promoted education, but he also made enemies fast. Then came the affair. Struensee began a secret relationship with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's English wife. It wasn't subtle. The court whispered, then shouted. Eventually, the Queen gave birth to a daughter rumoured to be Struensee's Presict. In 1772, the royal family struck back. A coup. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and beheaded. Caroline was exiled. Christian? He barely reacted. For the rest of his reign, he was little more than a figurehead. Other nobles controlled Denmark while the king scribbled nonsense in his journals and wandered the halls of his palace. He lived until 1808, trapped in a world no one else could see. A king in chains of the mind. And while Denmark tried to hide its madness, Greece was about to explode over a Queen's Bible translation, and the bodies would stack fast. Queen Olga of Greece translated the Bible into modern Greek. Her opponents rioted, and over 60 people died. It should have been a spiritual gift. Instead, it sparked a national bloodbath. Queen Olga of Greece, a Russian-born consort, wasn't known for controversy. She was devout, charitable, and focused on education. So, when she commissioned a translation of the New Testament from ancient Greek into the modern vernacular, she thought she was making it more accessible to the people. But in 1901, Greece was a nation obsessed with language and divided over it. Ancient Greek was sacred, classical, divine. Modern Greek, seen by purists as vulgar, peasant speech. The publication of the translation set off a political and cultural firestorm. Students, clergy, intellectuals outraged. Newspapers accused Olga of blasphemy, of desecrating holy scripture. The reaction was swift, violent, and bloody. Riots broke out across Athens. University students clashed with police. Protesters stormed Parliament. Shots were fired. By the end, more than 60 people lay dead in the streets all over a Bible. Olga was shaken. The project was buried. And the political fallout nearly cost the monarchy its fragile grip. It was a sobering lesson in how even piety can ignite flames when national identity is on the line. But if theological translation could kill dozens, the next emperor showed how a gladiator's ego could murder for applause. Roman Emperor Commodus fought and murdered. Opponents staged gladiatorial fights for entertainment. When you think of gladiators, you imagine slaves, criminals, men forced to die for Rome's amusement. You don't imagine the emperor stepping into the arena in golden armor, waving a sword, and pretending it's all real. Unless that emperor is Commodus, son of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. Commodus was handed an empire bathed in philosophy and stability, and he set it on fire. Where his father was stoic, Commodus was theatrical, vain, dangerous. He didn't just watch the games, he starred in them. Dressed like Hercules, club in hand, Commodus would descend into the Colosseum and battle animals already half dead or drugged. Lions, ostriches, giraffes. He killed hundreds. He'd even decapitate terrified civilians dressed as monsters, then parade around like a hero. But he wanted real combat too, so he took to fighting gladiators after making sure they were armed with wooden swords while he had steel. He never lost, of course. He demanded to be paid 1,000,000 sesterces per appearance, money taken from the state. Statues were built of him as a demigod. Months of the year were renamed in his honor. Even Rome itself was briefly renamed Colonia Commodiana. The Senate was humiliated, the army disgruntled, the people terrified. Eventually, his inner circle had enough. On the last day of 192 AD, Commodus was poisoned by his concubine. When that failed to kill him, a wrestler was brought in to strangle the emperor in his bath. The arena emperor died not on the sands of the Colosseum, but slipping beneath bathwater. And while Rome cleaned up its blood, India watched a great builder turn executioner before being locked away by his own son. Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, executed his rivals and was later imprisoned by his own son. He built the most beautiful tomb in the world, but Shah Jahan's reign was anything but peaceful. The Mughal emperor is best known for commissioning the Taj Mahal, a white marble monument to his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth. Love turned to legacy, and that legacy became one of the most iconic structures on earth. But behind the domes and roses was a ruler deeply steeped in blood. Before the Taj, before the morning, Shah Jahan spent his early years in battle, consolidating power, eliminating rivals. His own brothers weren't spared. Executions were swift, prisons permanent. And once he took the throne, his court became a nest of suspicion. Princes were pitted against one another. Intrigue danced behind the tapestries, but no one danced better than Aurangzeb, his son. Aurangzeb played the long game. While Shah Jahan was mourning his wife and pouring the empire's wealth into marble and inlay, Aurangzeb was building alliances, plotting. In 1658, when Shah Jahan fell ill, Aurangzeb seized the moment. He declared his father unfit to rule, marched on the capital, killed or imprisoned his brothers. And Shah Jahan? He was locked inside the Red Fort in Agra. His only comfort, a view of the Taj Mahal, visible from his prison window. He spent the last 8 years of his life in isolation, surrounded by memories and regret. When he died, Aurangzeb allowed him to be buried beside Mumtaz, under the dome he built for love, and lost everything else to keep. A tale of beauty, betrayal, and the long shadows cast by monuments. But while Shah Jahan died behind walls, another monarch across the ocean sold out his entire kingdom and pocketed the cash. King David Kalakaua of Hawaii took bribes and sold off Hawaiian lands to foreign powers. The merry monarch danced, drank, and drummed while his kingdom was being hollowed out from the inside. David Kalakaua became king of Hawaii in 1874, at a time when sugar plantations were multiplying and foreign interests, especially American, were circling like sharks. Kalakaua was a lover of culture. He revived hula, promoted native language, and filled his court with tradition. But he also had a taste for luxury, and he had a price. Kalakaua accepted lavish bribes from business interests and foreign diplomats. In return, he signed away crucial rights and privileges. Government appointments, land ownership, even tax exemptions for sugar barons. Slowly, piece by piece, Hawaiian sovereignty bled out. He took a taxpayer-funded world tour, visiting Asia and Europe, spending fortunes on gifts, banquets, and personal indulgence. Meanwhile, resentment boiled back home. Locals watched as their king partied, while foreign businessmen tightened their grip. By 1887, the opposition had enough. A group of armed white settlers and businessmen forced Kalakaua to sign the Bayonet Constitution, named because it was signed under literal threat of violence. That document stripped the monarchy of most of its power and handed it to the wealthy elite, mostly American. Kalakaua was now king in name only, a figurehead trapped by his own debts and compromises. He died in 1891 while visiting San Francisco. His sister, Queen Liliuokalani, inherited a kingdom already lost. Within a few years, the monarchy would be overthrown completely. Kalakaua danced to preserve Hawaiian spirit but sold the stage beneath his feet. And as the Pacific grieved its crown, back in ancient China, a new emperor was purging his enemies before the ink on his throne had even dried. Emperor Taizong of Tang dynasty ordered mass executions of rivals after taking the throne. Before he was Emperor Taizong, he was Prince Li Shimin, a general, a strategist, and a man determined to rule. But the throne of Tang China wasn't his by birthright, it was his by bloodshed. In the early 7th century, China was fractured, and the newly formed Tang dynasty was barely holding itself together. Li Shimin had proven himself in war, winning battles that helped his father seize the empire. But succession? That was a different battlefield. His elder brother, Crown Prince Li Jiancheng, stood in his way. Another brother, Li Yuanji, backed Jiancheng. Rumors swirled of plots to sideline or assassinate Shimin. Whether true or fabricated, Shimin acted first. In 626, he orchestrated what became known as the Xuanwu Gate Incident. Under the guise of a peaceful meeting, Shimin lured his brothers to a palace gate and ambushed them. He personally shot Jiancheng with an arrow and ordered Yuanji cut down. Their bodies were paraded to the emperor, their supporters arrested or executed. His father, shaken and outmaneuvered, abdicated days later. Shimin became Emperor Taizong, and the purge began. Hundreds of officials, generals, and family members loyal to the dead princes were rounded up. Some were executed publicly. Others were poisoned or forced to commit suicide. Whole family lines were erased. Their lands seized, their names blotted from records. Yet, once the blood dried, Taizong ruled wisely. He became one of China's most revered emperors, reforming the legal code, expanding education, and promoting meritocracy. His reign was remembered as a golden age. But it was built on fratricide, on calculated betrayal, on turning the imperial court into a silent graveyard. The dragon throne was his, but only after its rightful heirs were buried beneath it. And while Taizong secured his rule with arrows, the next empress preferred fire, floggings, and public mutilations. Tsarina Catherine the Great watched and encouraged the public torture of traitors during her reign. Catherine the Great wore pearls, quoted Voltaire, and modernized Russia with a stroke of her quill. But behind the Enlightenment shine was a ruler who ruled not just with diplomacy, but with pain. After orchestrating a coup to overthrow her husband, Peter III, and possibly having him killed, Catherine seized the throne in 1762. She styled herself as a philosopher queen, promoted science, culture, and law, built libraries, reformed administration. But rebellion would test her true nature. In 1773, a Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev led a massive peasant uprising, claiming to be Peter III alive and ready to reclaim the throne. Serfs, Cossacks, and disgruntled soldiers rallied under him. They wanted land, freedom, revenge. Catherine responded with fire. Her army crushed the rebellion in 1775. Thousands were executed, villages burned. And Pugachev? He was paraded through Moscow in an iron cage, displayed like a beast. Catherine personally ordered his public execution. They took him to the scaffold, read his sentence, then beheaded him slowly. His body was quartered. The pieces displayed in different cities as a warning. This wasn't an anomaly. Catherine publicly endorsed brutal punishments for traitors, dissidents, and rebels. Flogging, branding, exile to Siberia. The justice system under her reign was swift, harsh, and spectacular. Torture wasn't hidden, it was part of the message. And yet, the Empress continued to host salons, entertain philosophers, paint herself as the civilizing force of the East. A ruler of contradiction, forward-thinking on paper, medieval in punishment. And if you think Catherine's reign was soaked in irony, wait until you meet a king who signed a massacre, wiped his hands clean, and watched France burn from behind the curtains. King Charles IX of France signed off on the street Bartholomew's Day massacre, but tried to feign innocence. In the long, blood-drenched history of French monarchs, few moments were darker or more cowardly than the reign of Charles IX. He was young, uncertain, easily swayed, and at the heart of one of the most infamous mass killings in European history. It began in 1572 with a wedding meant to unify France. The Protestant leader Henry of Navarre was marrying Margaret of Valois, a Catholic princess. The hope was peace, an end to decades of religious civil war between Catholics and Huguenots. Instead, it became a slaughter. Catholic leaders feared a Protestant uprising. Charles's mother, Catherine de' Medici, persuaded him that a preemptive strike was necessary. He hesitated. She insisted. So he signed the order. On August 24, Street Bartholomew's Day, Catholic mobs and royal guards attacked Protestant leaders in Paris. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny was among the first to die stabbed, thrown from a window, and mutilated in the street. Then it spread. Thousands of Protestants, men, women, and children were hunted down across the city. Churches burned, doors smashed in, families executed in their beds. The Seine turned red. Estimates range from 5,000 to 30,000 dead. Not in battle, in cold blood. Charles IX claimed he'd been manipulated, that he didn't realize how far it would go. He issued proclamations condemning the violence after signing the papers that allowed it. His guilt consumed him. He became paranoid, sickly, haunted by nightmares and hallucinations. Blood seemed to drip from his hands even when they were clean. He died at 23, coughing up blood, raving about ghosts and betrayal. But the massacre outlived him, etched into memory, history, and every blade drawn in its name. And while Charles died of guilt, the next emperor killed his own brothers and caged his father to make sure nothing could stop him from seizing the throne. Emperor Aurangzeb of India executed his brothers and imprisoned his father to seize power. In the grand halls of the Mughal Empire, where every word was gilded and every gesture calculated, Aurangzeb chose a language far more brutal: blood. He was the third son of Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal. And while his father mourned love in marble, Aurangzeb plotted in silence. The Mughal throne was never guaranteed. It was earned through cunning, alliances, and if necessary, fratricide. When Shah Jahan fell ill in 1657, the succession crisis exploded. Aurangzeb's elder brother, Dara Shikoh, was the favorite liberal, philosophical, and beloved by their father. But Aurangzeb saw him as weak, soft, unfit to rule a Muslim empire. So he marched. Aurangzeb rallied forces, aligned with conservative Islamic factions, and waged a civil war against his own blood. In 1659, he captured Dara, paraded him through the streets in chains, and had him executed, beheaded, and dismembered, his remains displayed as a warning. He didn't stop there. He hunted his other brothers. Murad and Shuja were both defeated and executed. The road to power was littered with corpses bearing his own family name. And Shah Jahan? Aurangzeb didn't kill him. That would have been too merciful. He imprisoned his father in the Red Fort of Agra, placing him under house arrest for the rest of his life. From his window, Shah Jahan could see the Taj Mahal, the tomb of his wife, and now the symbol of everything he'd lost. Aurangzeb crowned himself emperor, ruling for nearly 50 years. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent, but his reign was marked by repression, religious intolerance, and endless war. Where earlier Mughal emperors embraced pluralism, Aurangzeb enforced orthodoxy. He destroyed Hindu temples, reintroduced jizya taxes, and censored culture. When he died, the empire was enormous but fractured, overextended, and ready to collapse. His path to power was paved in betrayal. His legacy, a crumbling monument to ambition. And while Aurangzeb ruled by the sword, the next king chose lawlessness, marrying illegally, breaking taboos, and leaving chaos in his wake. King George IV of England secretly married a Catholic widow, breaking multiple laws, then abandoned her. George IV was born to royalty, but lived like a man trying to outrun it. Gluttonous, vain, and reckless, he turned the British monarchy into a soap opera before television even existed. While still Prince of Wales, George fell in love, or lust, with Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic commoner. Under British law, the marriage was illegal. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 required the king's consent, which George never had, and Catholics completely forbidden for a future monarch. But George didn't care. In 1785, he married her anyway in a secret ceremony. It wasn't recognized by law, but it was real to Maria. She wore the ring, held the vows, believed she was his wife. Then George ran. When Parliament refused to cover his massive debts, millions spent on gambling, palaces, and parties, he struck a deal. He'd marry a Protestant princess for political funding. Enter Caroline of Brunswick, his legal wife. The marriage was a disaster. They hated each other on sight. George was drunk at the wedding. Caroline mocked his weight. They separated almost immediately after their daughter Charlotte was born. But George never stopped humiliating both women. He denied Caroline access to court, tried to divorce her with trumped-up adultery charges. Meanwhile, Maria was pushed into the shadows used when convenient, discarded when not. When George finally became king in 1820, he barred Caroline from his coronation. She tried to attend. Guards shut the door in her face. Maria, too, was left without a title, without recognition. She had loved him. He loved his own reflection. George IV's reign was marked by excess. He ballooned in size, addicted to laudanum and flattery. The Regency era may have given us Jane Austen and Beethoven, but behind the scenes, the king was a mess. He died bloated and alone in 1830. The crown passed on. His scandals remained. And if secret marriages and political hypocrisy seem shameful, the next sultan took it further, starting his reign by killing every sibling in his way. Sultan Selim the Grim of the Ottoman Empire executed 7 of his brothers upon ascending the throne. The Ottoman Empire had no time for sibling rivalry. It solved succession disputes the old-fashioned way by eliminating the competition. And no one did it more decisively than Sultan Selim, later known as Selim the Grim. When his father, Bayezid II, began hinting at abdication in the early 16th century, Selim didn't wait for a peaceful transition. He revolted, marched on his own father, forced him to step down, but his real ambition? Total control. Selim understood Ottoman politics. Power was fragile, and brothers meant civil war. So, upon claiming the throne, he acted swiftly. He ordered the execution of all his siblings, 7 brothers in total. Not exiled, not imprisoned, executed. Strangled with silk cords, the traditional method reserved for royal blood. It was clean, ritualized, horrifying. He didn't stop at brothers. His nephew's potential threats in the future were often eliminated as well. The message was clear. No claim but Selim's. And it worked. Selim the Grim ruled from 1512 to 1520, and in that short span, he transformed the Ottoman Empire. He conquered Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He declared himself Caliph, the defender of Islam. His military campaigns were ruthless and effective, but his reputation, unforgiving. He earned his nickname not just from executions but from his personality. Severe, stern, intolerant of failure. He ruled with iron discipline, and those around him knew. Loyalty was expected. Hesitation was punished. When he died of illness in 1520, his empire was larger, richer, and more centralized than ever before. Selim's legacy was power through purging, empire through extermination. And while he wielded death like a scepter, the next king fled his kingdom in disgrace, leaving behind a crumbling nation and a broken crown. King Alfonso XIII of Spain encouraged military dictatorship and fled the country, leaving chaos behind. King Alfonso XIII was born king, literally. His father died before he was born, so the crown was placed on his infant head the day he entered the world. But from cradle to exile, Alfonso's rule was marked by bad bets, worse alliances, and one fatal refusal to listen. He reigned during a time of massive upheaval, early 20th century Spain, still grappling with the loss of its empire, spiraling into economic inequality, labor unrest, and the rising tide of both anarchism and nationalism. Alfonso's answer to all of this? A dictator. In 1923, he supported a military coup led by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, a man who promised order through repression. Alfonso didn't just endorse the dictatorship, he leaned into it. Parliament was dissolved, the constitution suspended, press censored, civil liberties erased. The king thought he was securing the monarchy by wrapping it in iron. What he actually did was chain it to a man who couldn't fix Spain's problems. Primo de Rivera ruled for nearly 7 years, but his popularity tanked, the economy worsened, and opposition boiled. When the general resigned in 1930, Alfonso tried to distance himself too late. Elections in 1931 were a referendum on him. Republicans won in a landslide. Crowds poured into the streets. The monarchy wasn't voted out, it was chased out. Alfonso packed his bags and fled. No abdication, no fight. Just silence and an empty palace. Spain soon spiraled into civil war, and though Alfonso lived long enough to see Franco's rise, he never returned to power. He died in exile in 1941, a king who gambled his nation on a strongman and lost everything. And while Alfonso fled from the wreckage of his own rule, the next queen on our list walked away from the throne by choice, but left behind whispers of murder, scandal, and a shocking conversion. Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated, converted to Catholicism, and possibly orchestrated the murder of her lover. Queen Christina of Sweden wasn't your average monarch. She read Descartes, dressed like a man, refused marriage, and spent more time in philosophy salons than in war councils. Her court was a swirl of eccentricity, intellect, and scandal. Crowned in 1644 at the age of 18, she ruled during the height of Sweden's military might. But Christina wasn't interested in conquest. She wanted knowledge, art, independence. She studied theology, history, alchemy. She hosted scholars and actors. She enraged nobles by wearing pants and refusing to marry. The pressure to produce an heir was relentless. Her response? Abdication. In 1654, Christina shocked Europe by stepping down. She handed the crown to her cousin and disappeared traveling south, secretly converting from Lutheranism to Catholicism in Protestant-dominated Sweden. That alone was treasonous. But her time in Rome brought even more drama. She surrounded herself with poets, philosophers, and one particular favorite, Cardinal Decio Azzolino. Their relationship was unusually close, and rumors spread fast. Christina, now a Catholic convert, living lavishly, blurring lines of piety and politics. Then came the murder. In 1684, one of her close court members, Marchese Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, was accused of betrayal. Christina didn't hold a trial, she held a sword. Or rather, she ordered his execution right inside the Château de Fontainebleau in France. He was cornered, stabbed multiple times. Christina watched. Some say he leaked letters. Others claim it was personal jealousy, secrets, pride. But the message was clear. Exile hadn't dulled her ruthlessness. Christina died in 1689, buried in the Vatican, a Protestant queen turned Catholic, philosopher turned executioner. And while she murdered in marble halls, the next empress perfected the art of slow death, served cold, calculated, and laced with poison. Empress Dowager Cixi of China poisoned her political rivals, and even the young emperor Guangxu. She started as a low-ranking concubine. She ended as the most powerful woman in China. Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind silk screens, manipulating emperors like chess pieces. Her reign stretched over 4 decades during the twilight of the Qing dynasty, a time of rebellion, foreign invasion, and internal rot. Cixi wasn't interested in reform. She was interested in survival. When her son, the Tongji Emperor, died young, Cixi broke tradition by installing her nephew Gwanghaegun on the throne so she could keep pulling the strings. But Gwanghaegun grew bold. In 1898, he launched the 100 Days Reform, a sweeping attempt to modernize China's military, education, and government. Cixi crushed it. She had Gwanghaegun placed under house arrest. His allies were executed. Reformist ministers beheaded. And Gwanghaegun? He lived, technically. Trapped in the Forbidden City, powerless, watched, and humiliated. He remained a prisoner for 10 years. When Cixi sensed her end was near in 1908, she made sure he wouldn't outlive her. Just 1 day before her death, Gwanghaegun died suddenly. The cause? Arsenic enough to kill him several times over. The Empress had poisoned her own puppet to ensure no one could undo her legacy. Cixi's reign was one of contradiction. She preserved imperial power while destroying its future. She funded opulent palaces while peasants starved. She clung to tradition while the world modernized. When she died, the Qing dynasty was all but doomed. And if slow poisoning feels cruel, the next pope on our list took it further, turning the Vatican into a den of sin, bribery, and nightly orgies. Pope Alexander VI, part of the Borgia family, hosted orgies in the Vatican while bribing cardinals for power. The Vatican is supposed to be a bastion of holiness, but under Pope Alexander VI, it became the most scandalous house in Europe. Born Rodrigo Borgia, he was a Spanish cardinal with charm, ambition, and zero shame. In 1492, after a flurry of bribes and deals, he secured the papacy in one of the most corrupt conclaves ever held. From that moment on, the Borgia legacy of power, poison, and debauchery consumed the church. Alexander VI was a pope in title, but a Borgia in everything else. He openly acknowledged his multiple mistresses. He had children, yes, plural, while wearing the white robes of the pontiff. Most infamous among them was Cesare Borgia, whom he elevated to cardinal before turning him into a ruthless political enforcer. Then there was Lucrezia Borgia, his daughter, who was rumoured to be involved in poison plots, incest, and strategic marriages that ended in mysterious deaths. But the real horror wasn't just in whispers, it was in plain sight. Alexander held banquets in the Vatican with entertainers, alcohol, and women imported for pleasure. One infamous event, the Banquet of Chestnuts, saw dozens of courtesans brought into the papal palace to perform acts so debased they can't be aired without a content warning. Meanwhile, the church was sold to the highest bidder. Bishoprics, indulgences, pardons, everything had a price. Alexander used the papal treasury to enrich his family, fund wars, and eliminate enemies. Poison was allegedly a family tool. So was blackmail. He died in 1503, possibly poisoned himself by mistake. Even in death, his body reportedly decomposed rapidly, swelling and bursting. Poetic, some said. Divine judgment, others whispered. Alexander VI turned the Vatican into a palace of sin, where holy robes hid daggers and the only sacrament was power. But while Rome was dripping in corruption, Baghdad would soon erupt in a coup so violent, it wiped out a royal family in minutes. King Faisal II of Iraq was assassinated along with his family in a brutal 1958 coup. He was young, handsome, Western educated, Iraq's golden prince. And in 1958, King Faisal II died face down in a pool of blood, his entire dynasty erased in a matter of hours. Faisal II took the throne as a child after the suspicious death of his father, King Ghazi. Raised in Britain during World War II, he returned to Iraq to lead a monarchy already trembling beneath growing unrest. The country was caught in the crossfire of Cold War politics, nationalist movements, and anti-Western sentiment. Faisal, despite his youth, tried to modernize. He aligned with Britain and the US, formed the Baghdad Pact, and opened Iraq to Western oil interests. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. The public saw a king living in palaces while they lived in poverty. The army grew restless. The press whispered of revolution. Then came the 14th of July, 1958. A military coup erupted overnight, led by General Abdul Karim Qasim. Troops stormed the royal palace. Faisal, just 23 years old, was told he'd be escorted to safety. Instead, he was led into a courtyard and gunned down alongside members of his family, including his uncle, Crown Prince Abd al-Elah, and the Prime Minister. Their bodies were mutilated, dragged through the streets, hung in public squares. It wasn't just a coup, it was an execution designed for spectacle. The Hashemite monarchy, once seen as the bridge between East and West, was wiped from the map. Iraq descended into decades of authoritarianism, coups, and war. And the young king, who dreamed of diplomacy and development, became another tragic figure drowned by the tide of revolution. But if that sounds brutal, the next king didn't wait for rebellion. He executed anyone who defied his religion, turning faith into a death sentence. King Anarata of Burma executed anyone who refused to convert to Theravada Buddhism. In 11th century Burma, conversion wasn't optional. It was an ultimatum with a sword behind it. King Anarata is remembered as the unifier of Burma, founder of the pagan empire, builder of temples, and architect of a golden religious age. But behind the serene Buddha statues and sandstone stupas was a campaign of forced faith and lethal fanaticism. When Anarata came to power, the region was religiously diverse: Hinduism, Mahayana Buddhism, animism. Anarata chose Theravada Buddhism as the empire's spiritual foundation, not by persuasion, by decree. He demanded nationwide conversion, and for those who refused, death. Villages that clung to the old beliefs were razed, priests executed, shrines smashed, thousands were forcibly relocated. Sacred texts from rival traditions were burned, and resistance was met with brutal military force. His armies weren't just soldiers, they were missionaries with blades. Anarata also invaded neighboring kingdoms to enforce religious unity. He attacked Thetan, a Mande kingdom in modern-day Myanmar, claiming its monks refused to share their religious texts. The conquest brought libraries of scripture back to pagan and countless corpses left behind. He built hundreds of temples, sure, but they were constructed on the bones of dissenters. And while later histories painted him as a pious reformer, the truth is darker. A king who fused state and faith so tightly that nonconformity became heresy, and heresy became a capital crime. When he died in 1077, he left behind a legacy of unification, literacy, and religious dominance, but also blood-soaked altars, silenced gods, and a nation where faith was shaped by fear. And while Anarata spread doctrine through death, the next emperor would see his own people rise against him, crown him with betrayal, and finish his reign with a firing squad. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico took the throne with French support, only to be executed by his people. He arrived in Mexico draped in European silk and delusion. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico was an Austrian archduke, handpicked by Napoleon III of France to serve as puppet monarch in a land that neither needed nor wanted him. In 1864, he sailed across the Atlantic with his wife, Carlota, and a suitcase full of imperial fantasies. What he found was a country in chaos and not interested in emperors. Mexico was still reeling from civil war between liberals and conservatives. The conservatives, desperate for control, invited Maximilian to take the throne, promising him support and legitimacy. He accepted despite repeated warnings that his empire existed only on French bayonets. Maximilian, oddly enough, was a liberal at heart. He upheld many of the reforms introduced by President Benito Juarez, including land redistribution and religious freedom. This alienated the very conservatives who had installed him. Meanwhile, the liberals saw him as a foreign invader. He ruled from Chapultepec Castle, issuing decrees and entertaining European nobles, all while the country outside rejected him like a bad transplant. When the U.S. Civil War ended, the American government under the Monroe Doctrine pressured France to pull out. Napoleon III obliged, and Maximilian's support vanished. Left alone, Maximilian stayed, convinced he could still win the hearts of the Mexican people. Instead, he was captured by Republican forces in 1867. Juarez offered him a chance to escape with dignity. Maximilian refused. So they lined him up against a wall in Querétaro, a firing squad, a final salute. His last words were a plea for mercy not for himself, but for the country he never truly ruled. 3 bullets ended the empire. He had come to Mexico as royalty and left it as a martyr of European arrogance. And if being gunned down in a foreign land seems grim, the next king didn't need a revolution to spill blood, just a twitch of paranoia and a noble in the wrong place at the wrong time. King Erik XIV of Sweden killed a nobleman with his own hands during a fit of paranoia. Erik XIV of Sweden was a scholar, a poet, and a paranoid killer. He took the throne in 1560. A Renaissance man with a flair for intellect and the arts. He read astrology, translated texts, composed verse, but behind the crown and the cultivated mind was a storm of suspicion that would tear his reign apart. Erik believed the nobility, particularly the powerful Stuart family, was plotting against him. And maybe they were. But Erik didn't wait for evidence. He imagined it, rehearsed it, and then acted it out in blood. In 1567, the king summoned several members of the Stuart family under the pretense of peace. Once they were within reach, he snapped. During what became known as the Stuart murders, Erik personally stabbed Niels Stuart to death, reportedly while the man was on his knees, begging for mercy. He didn't stop there. His guards, acting on royal command, or possibly out of shared panic, slaughtered other members of the family. The massacre took place in Uppsala Castle, once a seat of royal diplomacy, now a blood-stained theatre of madness. Erik's mental health deteriorated rapidly after the killings. He raved, locked himself in rooms, claimed invisible enemies were poisoning him. He even dressed in disguises and roamed the countryside, convinced that assassins were lurking in every shadow. His own council deposed him in 1568. His brother John took the throne. Erik was imprisoned for years, moved from castle to castle, still delusional, still convinced he was king. In 1577, he died suddenly, likely poisoned, possibly by order of his brother. A brilliant mind undone by its own imagination. And while Erik drowned in delusion, the next king dove headfirst into a war of religion that would drench Eastern Europe in blood and fire. King Sigismund III of Poland waged religious wars that killed tens of thousands. Sigismund III. Vasa didn't just rule Poland, he tried to turn it into a battleground for his beliefs. Crowned King of Poland in 1587 and later inheriting the throne of Sweden, Sigismund seemed poised to unite 2 great kingdoms, but instead of harmony, he brought holy war. His obsession with Catholicism in a land filled with Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews lit the fuse for decades of conflict. Sigismund was raised a devout Catholic, and he believed it was his divine mission to purge Protestant influence from his realms. That mission clashed violently with the Polish tradition of religious tolerance. Instead of leading with unity, he ruled with zeal. He attempted to impose Catholic dominance across the Commonwealth, appointing bishops, restricting Protestant rights, and undermining the Warsaw Confederation, a document that had granted freedom of worship. Resistance flared, then boiled. In Sweden, he was overthrown by Protestant nobles, losing the throne to his uncle. But rather than accept defeat, Sigismund launched a series of military campaigns to reclaim it, igniting the Polish-Swedish Wars, a sprawling conflict that lasted nearly 60 years. Back in Poland, his religious policies fueled internal strife. The Polish-Muscovite War, the Moldavian Magnate Wars, endless clashes not just over borders, but over God. His reign left a staggering body count, tens of thousands dead, cities burned, borders redrawn. His legacy? A trail of martyrs, and shattered tolerance. He died in 1632, still insisting he was the rightful king of Sweden, still clinging to a vision of empire shaped by the crucifix rather than the crown. And if that sounds like divine tyranny, wait for the king who wrote to Portugal condemning slavery while cashing in on every human soul he could sell. King Afonso I of Congo profited heavily from the slave trade while condemning it in letters to Portugal. He was a devout Christian, a master of diplomacy, and one of Africa's most eloquent voices against the brutality of slavery. He was also knee-deep in it. King Afonso I of Congo ruled in the early 16th century, during the first surge of contact between West Africa and European powers. Baptized and educated by Portuguese missionaries, Afonso eagerly embraced Christianity. He wrote in fluent Portuguese, corresponded with the Vatican, and tried to turn Congo into a model Christian kingdom. But behind the hymns and holy rhetoric was a market for human bodies. Afonso initially partnered with Portugal to modernize Congo. Guns, goods, and technical knowledge flowed in paid for with slaves. Afonso believed he could control the trade, selling captured prisoners of war or criminals. But the demand kept growing, and so did the pressure to supply. Before long, the Portuguese bypassed his oversight entirely. Merchants and slavers began raiding villages, kidnapping citizens, and buying human cargo from local warlords. Afonso watched his kingdom transform into a hunting ground. Horrified, he wrote desperate letters to the Portuguese king, denouncing the lawlessness and pleading for regulation. "There are many merchants in all corners," he warned, "and they bring ruin to our country by taking our people." He claimed even nobles were being abducted, even his own relatives sold into bondage. Yet, the trade continued, and Afonso, for all his righteous words, kept benefiting from it. Slaves remained the primary currency for weapons and political leverage. He denounced the abuses but never dismantled the system that made him powerful. He died in 1542, a man torn between two worlds, one of Christian virtue and one of economic survival through human suffering. And as Afonso penned letters soaked in hypocrisy, the next king on our list wielded execution like a punishment for saying no. King Mwanga II of Buganda executed Christian converts for defying his sexual advances. In the late 19th century, as colonialism clawed its way into Africa, one young monarch in present-day Uganda erupted into global infamy, not for conquest, but for a personal vendetta cloaked in royal rage. Mwanga II became king of Buganda at just 16, inheriting a fragile kingdom caught between three rising forces: Christianity, Islam, and European imperialism. But Mwanga's greatest threat wasn't external. It was inside his own palace servants, pages, and young men who began refusing him because of their faith. Mwanga was known to demand sexual submission from the royal pages young boys assigned to serve him. But with the arrival of Christian missionaries came a new moral code. Many converts refused Mwanga's advances, citing their beliefs. Others fled the court altogether. The king exploded. In 1886, he ordered a brutal crackdown. Dozens of Christian converts, Catholic and Anglican, were arrested and brought before him. Some were his former pages. Some were barely teenagers. Mwanga gave them a choice: renounce their faith and obey his will, or die. They chose martyrdom. 22 young men were burned alive at Namugongo, their bodies consumed by fire as they prayed. Others were speared, hacked apart, or tortured. The executions were designed to be public, humiliating, and final, but they had the opposite effect. The killings shocked the world, Missionaries recorded the events, spreading word to Europe and igniting international outrage. The Ugandan martyrs, as they became known, were later canonized by the Catholic Church. Mwanga tried to maintain control, but colonial powers used the crisis as a pretext to intervene. He was deposed, reinstated, then overthrown again, eventually dying in exile. His reign left behind a complicated legacy, one of resistance against colonialism, but also horrific cruelty against his own people. In the end, he became a symbol not just of tyranny, but of how power turns personal darkness into national tragedy. And with that, our journey through 53 dark royal facts comes to an end. A trail of blood-soaked thrones, gilded horrors, and the high price of unchecked power.